Okay, we're going to talk about the political system in America. We really did not have a political system in America prior to Washington's farewell address. And one of the things he said right off the bat is do not form political parties. But you're going to find out that we do anyway. So that is our subtopic, the rise of the two-party system in America. Now, Jordan, we still have this today. We have Democrats and Republicans. That's not how this thing's going to start out. But from this point on, we are going to have the two-party system of politics in America from then until now. And there's goods and bads about it. But remember, Washington said, do not start political parties. Well, we had listened. So despite the recommendation of President Washington in his farewell address, something that resembled political parties actually appeared in 1796. So from 1796 to 2018, we have had the two-party system in America. Something our very first president... Need a pencil or something? You need a pencil or something? Oh, because you didn't write anything down. What? 17?
76. 96.
Oh.
97. That'd be good to start right. Now, who do these two parties center around? Which two individuals? Thomas, not Thomas J. and Alexander H. Yeah, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. This is how it went. Hamilton's supporters were in what part of the colonies, or the states, excuse me, geographically?
What?
North and south. So which one was Hamilton? Shh, you two are driving me nuts. Just listen, right, and you'll be much better off. Hamilton was north and Jefferson was south. So, Hamilton and his supporters from the north became known as the Federalists. And they would establish the Federalist Party. So again, Alexander Hamilton and the Northerners would become known as Federalists. And they will form the Federalist Party. Thomas Jefferson and the Southerners, his supporters, became known as the Republicans and started what became the Republican Party. Now, ironically, are most Southerners in the United States today Republican or Democrat? They're Democrat, which isn't like the Federalist Party because we're going to have some renovation. And the Republican Party is going to change. We're still calling it the Republican Party, but viewpoints are going to change between 1796 and the present on what the Republicans stand for. But this is how we started. And as you can imagine, as there is today, there was a lot of philosophical differences between the Federalist Party and the Republican Party. Just like today, we have all kinds of philosophical differences between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. It hasn't changed much. Unfortunately, because if we could work together and get away from this two-party system, we might be able to get something done in this country. That's kind of what people think. So, basically what has happened is the Federalist Party, under the direction of Alexander Hamilton, now has different viewpoints than the Republican Party that was established by Thomas Jefferson. And George Washington said from the start, do not do this. One of the biggest concerns he had leaving his presidency was the bitter disputes and arguments between these two guys, right? And now these two guys split even farther by forming these groups or political parties. Now I'm going to tell you the difference between the two parties. And I'm going to start with the Federalist Party and tell you what they believed in. This is the Federalist Party. So you should write in your paper, the Federalist Party, and underline it. And these are the things that the Federalist Party believed in. First of all, the Federalist Party had little faith in the ability of the average person to govern themselves. They had little faith in the ability of the average person to govern themselves. They basically thought that the average person wasn't smart enough to govern themselves, that they shouldn't even be involved. Isn't that what resulted in the Electoral College in the first place? Where was a common man voting? No, the electors were voting, right? So that makes sense. Yeah.
You say that again.
Yeah, the Federalist Party had little faith in the ability of the average person to govern themselves. They didn't think the average Joe could govern themselves, that they weren't smart enough to do that. The Federalist Party also, number 2, wanted to give all the political power to the wealthy people. They wanted to give all political power to wealthy people. The Federalist Party, number 2, wanted to give all political power to the wealthy people. Doesn't that mean they want the federal government under the control of the wealthy? Isn't that what we're saying? Same thing, yeah. Right? Number 3, remember the National Bank of the United States? They supported that. The Federalist Party supported the National Bank of the United States, supported it. The national, remember they put together the National Bank of the United States, so we had a place for a treasury and all that? They supported the National Bank of the United States. And number 4, these were the type of people that belonged to the Federalist Party. Merchants, because they were wealthy, very good. Lawyers, because they were wealthy. Manufacturers, those that made things to sell to the merchants, because they were wealthy. And church leaders, because church leaders at the time were very wealthy. So the Federalist Party included merchants who were wealthy, lawyers who were wealthy, manufacturers who sold to the merchants who were wealthy, and church leaders that were wealthy. So, Federalist Party again had little faith in the ability of the average person to govern themselves. They wanted to give power to the wealthy people. In other words, they wanted a federal government under the control of the wealthy. They supported the Bank of the United States, the National Bank of the United States, and their people included wealthy merchants, wealthy lawyers, wealthy manufacturers, and wealthy church leaders. No. Now, we'll talk about the Republican Party, because you're going to see the polar opposite here in a lot of ways. So it should be easier to take notes. So if the Federalist Party had little faith in the ability of the average person to govern themselves, the Republican Party had great faith in the ability of the average person to govern themselves. So just the opposite. Whereas the Federalists didn't have any confidence the average person can govern themselves, the Republican Party had great faith in the ability of the average person to run the government. Now, I want to ask you a question here. This is 100%, right? Of this 100% of the population in the United States at this time, Marcus, how many do you think were Federalists? Or let me rephrase it. How many of this 100% of the people who populated the United States were considered an average person? An average person. How many of that 100% do you think was an average person? The whole population. In other words, we get the whole population in this class. How many in here, what percentage in here would be considered an average person? Okay, well, let's look in here. Let's look at these kids. Okay, just kind of look at the demographics. I know you don't know all these kids. I don't know them all either, but I don't see any of them wearing $100,000 watches, or I don't see them, you know, they look pretty average to me, as I am. So what do you think the percentage of average people were in the United States? What? Pretty close. 90% of the population in the United States at this time would be considered the average person, whereas only 10% of the population of the United States would be considered wealthy. Yet they want 10% to run the government. I mean, that's kind of what their philosophy was. So again, we're talking about the Republican Party, who had great faith in the ability of the average person, 90% of the people that lived in the country, to run the government. Another thing the Republicans did, and I want you to understand this because it's important, is they favored a limited federal government. They favored a limited federal government. Now, you hear this today, kiddos, about local control. Anybody heard the comment local control? I'll give you kind of an example. The grading scale at Worland High School is 90, 80, 70, 60. Who made that up? Who made that the rule? Who officially made that the rule?
School board.
Well, principal probably recommended it, but who officially made the rule? School board, okay? So, that's local control, where your local school board. Non-local control would be if the federal government in Washington said to Worland High School, your grading scale will be 95 to 100's an A, 85 to 94 is a B. If they push that upon you, that would be federal control. So if this party favors a limited federal government, then they are favoring a strong. Who do they want to make the decisions? Each state. So, Republicans are saying we want a limited federal government. In other words, we don't want the federal government telling us what to do. Which means that who has local control? The state. And I use that comparison because local control means that the local school board here determines what the grading scale is, not the governor of Wyoming. You see what I mean? Local control means you give control to the people that are running each individual government. So they're saying we don't want the federal government, Washington, D.C., telling us what to do. We want, as the state of Wyoming, make the rules for our state, not have federal regulations. That's a fight even today. We still fight about local control. Okay? So, the first thing about the Republican Party, they had great faith in the ability of the average person to run the government. They favored limited federal government, number 2. And number 3, they favored strong state government. Number 2, limited federal government. Number 3, strong state government. Now, what do you think their philosophy was of the National Bank of the United States? Against it. They were against it. They were against it. Now, here's another question I have for you. Geographically. Where do you think most of the Federalists lived, Ollie? Geographically, where did they live? Now, you got to remember that we kind of, although this is the states here, we do have ownership to the Mississippi River here, right? But where do most of the wealthy Federalists live geographically on that map? What would be your guess? They're merchants. They're merchants. They're church leaders. They're all going to be along the eastern seaboard. Because what happens in the eastern seaboard? Trade. So all of your wealthy merchants, all your wealthy church leaders, all your wealthy lawyers, etc., and manufacturers, all the population all along here were your wealthy people. Where were your non-wealthy people, or your Republicans? Where did they live? Everywhere pretty much else. And some clear into the frontier here, okay? So your average man, or people of a support, Thomas Jefferson, the Republicans, lived everywhere but the eastern seaboard. The wealthy people lived on the eastern seaboard, okay? That's where they lived. Now, back to the formation of two political parties. It was stated that historians believe that by 1800, most people decided if they were Federalist or Republican. By 1800, most people had decided which they were. So from 1800 now, political life in the United States is going to revolve around the two-party system. It still does today. It's just Republicans and Democrats today. Then it was Federalists and Republicans. Although don't let the word Republican make you think that the Republicans then believe the same thing the Republicans now, because we're going to have lots of transitions over the next 200 years on this political party. Anybody have any questions about that first subtopic? Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about today then is the election of 1796. We're going to have our first election, kiddos, with political parties involved. Okay, it's going to be different. There's going to be one rule that's the same. 1796 on your ID sheet. So we're going to have political parties for the first time, but there's going to be one little snag that remains that causes a snafu in this election. Okay? So, when we talk about the election of 1796, each party, right, the Federalists got together and they chose their candidate for president and vice president. And the Republicans got together over here and they chose their candidate for president and vice president. No longer would everybody just be running for president, right? They're going to separate. So, the Federalists get together and they nominate John Adams, familiar name, for president. John Adams is nominated for president by the Federalist Party. And they're going to nominate a fellow by the name of Thomas Pinckney. We should remember him because he went to Spain to negotiate that treaty, remember, that gave us the right of deposit. He's going to be the Federalist nominee for vice president. So on the Federalist ticket, or for the Federalist Party, running in the election of 1796, you have John Adams for president specifically, and Thomas Pinckney for vice president. Adams, we've heard of him obviously, and Pinckney is the guy that went to Spain on orders from George Washington to negotiate so we got the right of deposit for the Mississippi. That's the Federalist Party. John Adams for president, Thomas Pinckney for vice president. So who obviously do the Republicans nominate for president? Who? Thomas Jefferson, no question. Thomas Jefferson. And then remember Aaron Burr, who got 1 vote in the last election? He's going to be the Republican vice presidential candidate. So for the Republicans, you have Thomas Jefferson running for president, and Aaron Burr, B-U-R-R, who received the 1 electoral vote in the election of 1790. What was it? 1792, for vice president. Now, this is where the snafu came in. During the election, most people assumed, and we talked about assuming, that you would either vote one party or the other, right? You'd either be a Federalist or Republican. You know the only thing they didn't change for this election that's going to cause us a problem? What was the old rule? What? What was the old rule on electing a president? What? Person with the most votes is president, and person with the second most votes is vice president. They forgot to take that rule out for this election. So when the ballots were counted, the voters were shocked. Aaron Burr received 30 votes, so he was out. He was the vice presidential candidate for the Republicans. Thomas Pinckney received 59 votes. He was the vice presidential candidate for the Federalists. Thomas Jefferson receives 68 votes, and John Adams receives 72. So what have you got, Marcus? You've got a Federalist president and a Republican vice president. Not good. Not good. Go ahead, Leilani. John Adams. Jay won't be talked to about much more. So I want to go through this again. So they run and people think they're going to vote on separate ballots, but they don't. And so when you get through this thing, Burr gets 30 votes, Pinckney gets 59, Jefferson gets 68, and Adams gets 72. So by virtue of their own rule, Thomas Jefferson, a Republican, will be the vice president, and John Adams, a Federalist, will be the president. Yes?
How many votes did Jefferson have?
Jefferson had 68. 72 for Adams. Now, can you imagine, think about this, can you imagine if Donald Trump was the president and Hillary Clinton was the vice president? I'm not kidding you. This compares to that. This would be about the same thing as if we ran this last election and Hillary Clinton got the second most votes. Actually, if you think about it the way it was, Hillary Clinton got the most votes, right? Yeah. Not electoral votes. But Trump got the most electoral votes, which we're still using, right? Yeah. And Hillary got the second amount. That would make her the vice president under Donald Trump. Can you imagine that after watching any of the debates? Yeah. That's the kind of mess we have, okay? That's the kind of mess. So, after this election, it became kind of an unwritten law that you were expected to vote for only one party in this election. They didn't change the rule of first and second, you know what I'm saying? But they changed the other rule. about you were going to vote for your own. If you vote Federalist, you vote Federalist. You know, if you vote Republican, you vote Republican. That didn't happen. And they're going to have to change that with an amendment to the Constitution even later, because we're going to have another snafu in these elections. It took us a little bit of time, kiddos, to get our stuff together on these political elections once political parties came into the mix. Okay? So now we're going to have to deal, how'd you like to be John Adams, dealing with a disloyal, without question, vice president. That's what's going to happen here. Well, that'll take us to our next subtopic I want to just get a start on, and we'll finish it tomorrow. And that's on the verge of war with France and the Xyz Affair. Okay? On the verge of war with France and the Xyz Affair. And I'm going to make one statement, then we're going to quit, so you're not done yet. Mr. Shut him up early. On the verge of war with France and the Xyz Affair. The problem is, even though President Adams was not very pleased to have a Republican vice president, he didn't have any time to worry about it, because by the time he took the oath of office as our second president, we were about to get ourselves in a war with France. And we didn't want any part of that. And so what we'll tell you tomorrow is what President Adams did to avoid war with France. Because again, we did not want to go to war because we weren't prepared. But France wanted a piece of us, and after Adams took the presidency, he didn't have time to worry about who his vice president was. He had to find a way to keep the United States out of war. And the only reason he keeps us out of the war is because of blind luck. And we'll tell you about that tomorrow. Okay? All right, we're good to go.